My sister demanded my franchise to prove she was smart. My parents forced me to sign it away for family. I shut down the main supplier contracts the same day. The franchise lost value, $430,000. They went completely bankrupt in months. Picture a dining room table in Boise, Idaho, on a Sunday evening, plates barely cleared, a family gathered around like it's an ordinary dinner. Picture a woman sitting at the head of that table, arms crossed, demanding a business she never built. Picture two parents nodding along, pushing a pen across the table like it's a small favor between siblings. And picture the daughter across from all three of them, signing her name on a line that felt like giving away 10 years of her life in 30 seconds. That signature ended one chapter. What happened in the following 24 hours started a completely different story, one nobody at that table saw coming. A franchise looks simple from the outside. A name on a sign, a logo on a cup, a location on a corner. What people rarely see is the web underneath it, the supplier deals, the private contracts, the relationships built one phone call at a time across years of early mornings and long nights. A signature can transfer a business name in an instant. A signature cannot transfer trust that took a decade to build with the people who actually keep the shelves stocked. This is a story about a family who believed ownership meant everything and forgot that ownership means nothing without the foundation holding it up. Smash that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and let's go back to Boise, back to a girl who built something real with her own two hands, long before anyone at that table ever thought to take it from her. My name is Hannah Sorensen, and I am 33 years old. I grew up in Boise, Idaho, in a small rambler house on the west side of town, where my father, Curtis Sorensen, worked as a route driver for a regional beverage distributor, and my mother, Deanne, worked part-time at a dry cleaner near our neighborhood. Money stayed tight through most of my childhood, my parents stretching every paycheck across rent, groceries, and the occasional unexpected car repair that always seemed to arrive at the worst possible moment. I have one sibling, my younger sister Chelsea, born 3 years after me. From the earliest years I can remember, Chelsea occupied a specific place in our family that I never quite occupied myself. She was outgoing, quick with a joke, comfortable walking into any room and immediately becoming the center of it. I was quieter, more careful, more likely to be found reading in my bedroom than performing for relatives at a holiday gathering. My parents loved us both. I want to say that clearly because this story never turns them into simple villains. But love showed up differently for each of us growing up. Chelsea received praise for her personality, her charm, the way she lit up a room. I received praise, when it came at all, for being responsible, for handling things quietly, for never causing trouble that required anyone's attention. I worked my first job at 14, sweeping floors and stocking shelves at a small neighborhood grocery store within walking distance of our house. I saved almost everything I earned, watching that number grow slowly in a savings account. I opened myself at the credit union down the street, a habit that felt less like discipline and more like simple survival, a way of making sure I never depended entirely on anyone else for what I needed. High school brought a part-time job at a smoothie and juice shop near Boise State University, a small independent location before it eventually became part of a growing regional franchise chain called Harvest Cup. I started as a counter worker, mixing drinks and running the register, and within a year I had learned every single part of that business, from inventory ordering to supplier scheduling to the specific rhythm of managing a morning rush during finals week. The owner of that location, a woman named Patricia Nallen, took a genuine interest in my work ethic. She let me shadow her during supplier calls, taught me how to negotiate delivery schedules, showed me exactly how a small business survived on thin margins by managing every single cost with careful, consistent attention. She said to me once, standing behind the counter during a slow afternoon, "Hannah, most people running these franchises think the brand does the work. The brand gets people through the door once. What keeps them coming back, and what actually keeps you in business, is everything happening behind the counter that customers never see." I held on to that lesson for years. I attended Boise State University on a partial scholarship, studying business administration, while continuing to work at Harvest Cup throughout my entire college career, eventually earning a promotion to assistant manager during my junior year. Patricia trusted me increasingly with the operational side of the business, including something that became critically important years later: the relationships with our regional produce and dairy suppliers. I want to explain this part carefully, because it became the single most important detail of everything that eventually happened in my family. Harvest Cup, as a franchise brand, provided corporate-approved supplier lists and standard ingredient specifications to every location across the region. But Patricia, operating her specific location for over a decade, had built a separate arrangement with several key regional suppliers, arrangements that went beyond what corporate required, securing better pricing, fresher produce, and priority delivery windows during peak demand periods. These arrangements existed as private agreements between Patricia's personal holding company and the individual suppliers themselves, contracts that were never formally part of the Harvest Cup franchise agreement, structured this way specifically because Patricia wanted flexibility corporate standardization never allowed. I graduated from Boise State and continued working for Patricia full-time, eventually becoming general manager of her original location and helping her expand into 2 additional Harvest Cup franchise territories across the Boise metro area over the following several years. Patricia, approaching retirement age and without children of her own interested in taking over the business, began mentoring me specifically as her eventual successor. She said, during one of our final planning conversations before her retirement, "Hannah, I'm going to sell you these franchise locations at a fair price, well below what they're actually worth on the open market, because you earned this. But I want you to understand something important. I'm keeping my personal supplier holding company entirely separate from this sale. Those relationships took me 15 years to build, and I'm not simply handing them over as part of a real estate transaction. I'll teach you everything you need to build your own version of that same foundation, starting from scratch, under your own name." I spent my final 2 years working alongside Patricia, specifically learning this exact process, meeting personally with each regional supplier, understanding their businesses, their families, their specific needs and preferences, slowly building genuine relationships that existed independently from the Harvest Cup corporate structure entirely. I formed my own private holding company, Sorensen Supply Partners, during this transition period, structured specifically to hold these independent supplier agreements separately from whatever franchise entity would eventually own and operate the physical Harvest Cup locations themselves. I purchased the 3 Harvest Cup franchise locations from Patricia when I turned 28 years old, using a combination of my personal savings, a small business loan, and a modest investment from my parents, who genuinely believed in my work ethic even if they rarely expressed it in the same enthusiastic way they expressed pride in Chelsea's accomplishments. Over the following 5 years, I grew those 3 locations into a genuinely successful regional franchise territory, eventually expanding to 7 Harvest Cup locations across the greater Boise area, building a business that generated significant annual revenue, and more importantly to me personally, represented a decade of my own hard work built almost entirely with my own 2 hands. Chelsea, during these same years, pursued a series of business ventures that never quite achieved the same lasting success. A boutique clothing store that closed within 18 months, a social media marketing consultancy that generated inconsistent income at best, a brief, unsuccessful attempt at real estate investment that resulted in a financial loss my parents quietly helped cover. I never resented Chelsea for these struggles. I genuinely wanted her to find something that worked for her, understanding that different people find their footing on different timelines. What I never expected, not once across those 5 years of building my own franchise territory, was that Chelsea's struggles would eventually become framed, within our family, as something I was somehow responsible for fixing. The specific conversation that changed everything happened on an ordinary Sunday evening in September, during what began as a routine family dinner at my parents' house, the same house I grew up in, the same dining room table where I completed homework assignments decades earlier. Chelsea arrived that evening with an energy I recognized immediately as different from her usual relaxed demeanor. Something sharper, more deliberate, like she had rehearsed whatever conversation she intended to have that night. Dinner proceeded normally at first, ordinary conversation about work, about my parents' recent doctor appointments, about a home renovation project Chelsea had recently started, and then, predictably, abandoned partway through. But as my mother cleared the dinner plates, Chelsea shifted the conversation in a direction I genuinely never anticipated. She said, "Hannah, I want to talk about the Harvest Cup locations." I said, "What about them?" She said, "I think it's time you considered bringing me in as a partner. Or honestly, considering handing me full ownership of at least a few of the locations." I sat there for a moment, processing what she had just said, genuinely uncertain whether she meant this seriously. I said, "Chelsea, I built those locations from 3 purchased territories into 7, over 5 years of full-time work. That's not something I'm simply handing over." She said, "I need this, Hannah. I need to prove I can run something successful too. Everyone in this family treats you like the responsible one and treats me like I can't hold anything together. I need a real chance to prove I'm just as capable." I want to describe honestly what I felt hearing this, because it genuinely caught me completely off guard. Chelsea wanted a piece of my business, not because she had developed any specific expertise in franchise operations, not because she had contributed any capital or labor toward building it, but specifically because she wanted the appearance of success it represented within our family's specific dynamic. I said carefully, "Chelsea, I understand you're going through a difficult period professionally, but asking me to hand over a business I built entirely myself isn't a solution to that. I'm happy to help you in other ways, mentoring you, maybe even helping you start your own franchise territory from scratch." She said, her voice rising slightly, "I don't want to start from scratch. I want something that's already working." My father spoke up at this point, and what he said genuinely surprised me, given how uninvolved he had remained in my business decisions across the previous 5 years. He said, "Hannah, your sister is struggling. Family takes care of family. Maybe it's worth considering giving her one of the locations just to help her get on her feet." I said, "Dad, I didn't build this business by having someone hand me a location. I worked for Patricia for over a decade before she trusted me enough to sell me anything." My mother added, quietly but firmly, "Hannah, your sister needs this. We're asking you to think about your family instead of just yourself for once." That specific phrase, "think about your family instead of just yourself," landed with a weight I genuinely never expected from my own parents. 5 years of building a business, working 60-hour weeks, managing supplier relationships and staff scheduling and every single operational detail personally. And somehow, sitting at that table, my effort had been reframed as selfishness. I want to be honest about the following several weeks, because they involved a specific kind of family pressure that I genuinely struggled to navigate. My parents called regularly, each conversation gently but persistently returning to the same theme. Chelsea needed support, family should share success. I had built something wonderful, and surely I could find a way to include my sister in it. Chelsea herself called multiple times, alternating between emotional appeals about her own struggles, and occasionally, sharper comments suggesting I had always considered myself better than her, more responsible, more deserving of success. I consulted a business attorney during this period, a man named Gary Whitlock, who had helped me structure my original franchise purchase years earlier, explaining the entire family situation and asking specifically what my legal options actually looked like if family pressure continued escalating. Gary said, "Hannah, legally, this is entirely your business. Nobody can force you to transfer ownership against your will, but I understand family pressure operates outside strictly legal boundaries. If you do eventually decide to transfer any ownership stake, I'd strongly recommend we structure it very carefully, protecting your other business interests separately." I held on to that specific piece of advice, though I genuinely hoped, at that point, that the entire situation would eventually resolve without requiring any transfer at all. The pressure intensified significantly during a second family dinner roughly 6 weeks after that initial conversation. My parents had clearly coordinated their approach in advance, both presenting a unified, insistent front regarding what they now framed not simply as a request, but as something closer to a family obligation. My father said, "Hannah, your mother and I have discussed this extensively. We think it's time you seriously considered signing over at least 3 of the 7 locations to Chelsea. We raised both of you the same way, gave you both the same opportunities. It's not fair that you ended up with everything while she has nothing." I said, "Dad, I didn't end up with anything. I built this specifically over years of work neither of you were involved in." My mother said, her voice carrying a specific edge I rarely heard from her, "Hannah, we're your parents. We're asking you to do this for your family. If you refuse, I genuinely don't know how we move forward as a family going forward." I want to describe the specific weight of that ultimatum, because it represents exactly the moment everything shifted for me personally. My parents were framing my refusal to hand over a business I built entirely myself as a threat to our entire family relationship, positioning years of my own hard work as something owed to my sister, simply because we shared the same parents. I left that dinner that evening without providing a final answer, driving home in a state of genuine emotional exhaustion, understanding that whatever decision I eventually made would carry consequences I could genuinely never fully predict. I spent the following month in a state of genuine internal conflict, torn between my own understanding of what I had built and earned, and a lifetime of family conditioning that told me maintaining peace within my family mattered more than protecting my own interests. I met with Gary Whitlock again during this period, walking through every possible option available to me. He explained clearly that I retained complete legal authority over my own business, that no court or legal mechanism could force me to transfer ownership against my will, and that whatever decision I ultimately made needed to come from my own genuine judgment rather than family pressure alone. But family pressure, as anyone who has experienced it deeply understands, operates through channels that exist entirely outside legal or rational boundaries. My parents began involving extended family members in the conversation, aunts and uncles calling to express their own opinions about family loyalty and shared success. My mother stopped answering my calls for nearly 2 weeks, a specific silence that communicated her disappointment more effectively than any direct conversation could have. I want to be completely honest about the specific moment I finally agreed to the transfer, because understanding my own thought process during that moment matters significantly to everything that happened afterward. My parents invited me to dinner one final time, roughly 2 months after the original conversation, and this time, Chelsea arrived with a printed document already prepared, a formal ownership transfer agreement her own attorney had drafted, covering 3 of my 7 Harvest Cup franchise locations. My father said, sliding the document across the table toward me, "Hannah, we're asking you one final time. Sign this and let's move forward as a family. Refuse, and I genuinely don't know what happens to our relationship going forward." I sat at that table for a long moment, looking at that document, understanding clearly the specific weight of what signing it actually meant. I want to explain something important about my specific mental state during that exact moment, because it shaped the decision I made immediately afterward. I understood, sitting at that table, that the Harvest Cup franchise agreements themselves, the physical locations, the corporate branding rights, the standard operational licenses, existed as one specific legal structure. But the supplier relationships I built over years through Sorensen Supply Partners, my own private holding company, existed as an entirely separate legal structure, one that had genuinely never been part of any conversation my family had with me across those 2 exhausting months. Nobody at that table, not my parents, not Chelsea, not even Chelsea's own attorney who drafted that transfer document, understood the specific distinction between the franchise locations themselves and the private supplier network that actually kept those locations profitably stocked with fresh, competitively priced ingredients. I signed that document that evening, transferring formal ownership of 3 Harvest Cup franchise locations to Chelsea, watching my parents' visible relief as I placed the pen down on that dining room table. Chelsea said, genuinely excited, "Thank you, Hannah. I promise I'm going to make you proud." I said quietly, "I hope you do, Chelsea." I drove home that night in a state of complicated emotion, grief over losing something I had built with genuine personal sacrifice, alongside a specific, quiet clarity about exactly what my next move needed to be. I called Gary Whitlock first thing the following morning. I said, "Gary, I signed the transfer last night. 3 locations are now formally under Chelsea's ownership." He said, "How are you doing with that?" I said, "Honestly, I'm processing it, but I want to discuss something specific with you today. Sorensen Supply Partners, my private supplier holding company, was never part of that transfer agreement. I want to understand exactly what my options look like regarding those existing supplier contracts." Gary reviewed the transfer document carefully during our call, confirming exactly what I already understood clearly. He said, "Hannah, you're correct. This transfer agreement covers only the Harvest Cup franchise licenses and physical location assets. Sorensen Supply Partners and every private supplier contract under that holding company remains entirely separate, entirely under your continued ownership and control. Nothing in this agreement obligates you to continue extending those specific supplier arrangements to the 3 locations you just transferred." I said, "So I retain full authority to end those specific supplier agreements as they relate to those 3 locations?" He said, "Completely. Those are private contracts between your holding company and individual suppliers, structured entirely independently from the franchise ownership itself. You could terminate the specific delivery arrangements benefiting those 3 locations immediately, provided you follow whatever notice requirements exist within each individual supplier contract." I reviewed each supplier agreement carefully that same day, confirming the specific notice periods required, most ranging from immediate termination rights to a maximum 30-day transition window, depending on the specific supplier relationship involved. I want to explain honestly what motivated my decision at that exact moment, because this story deserves that honesty. I never acted out of pure vindictiveness. I acted from a genuine, clear-eyed understanding that Chelsea had received formal ownership of 3 business locations without ever developing the actual operational expertise, supplier relationships, or specific industry knowledge required to run them successfully at the level I had built them to over 5 years. Continuing to personally extend my own privately negotiated supplier advantages to locations I no longer owned made genuinely no logical business sense, especially given the circumstances under which that ownership transfer occurred in the first place. I began formally notifying each affected supplier the following morning. I contacted each supplier individually over the following several days, explaining honestly and professionally that ownership of the 3 affected locations had transferred to a new operator, and that my private supply arrangements, structured specifically around my personal business relationships built over years, would no longer extend to those specific locations effective at the end of each contract's required notice period. Most suppliers understood this explanation immediately, given that private supplier holding arrangements structured this way were reasonably common within the regional franchise industry. And given that my own continued 3 remaining Harvest Cup locations, plus my own separate Sorensen Supply Partners business relationships with other independent clients, remained valuable enough that none of these suppliers had any specific interest in damaging our ongoing professional relationship. The 3 transferred locations, now formally operating under Chelsea's ownership, faced an immediate and significant operational challenge. The standard Harvest Cup corporate supplier list, the baseline arrangement available to any franchise owner regardless of independent negotiation, offered notably higher pricing, less consistent delivery scheduling, and lower quality produce specifications compared to the private arrangements I had spent years building. Chelsea called me roughly 2 weeks after taking over those 3 locations, her voice carrying genuine confusion and mounting frustration. She said, "Hannah, our produce costs just increased almost 30% overnight. Our dairy delivery schedule keeps getting pushed back, and we're running out of key ingredients during peak hours. What's happening?" I said, honestly, "Chelsea, the specific supplier arrangements that kept costs low and delivery consistent across those locations existed through my own private holding company, Sorensen Supply Partners. That company remained entirely separate from the franchise transfer agreement you signed. Those private arrangements ended when I formally notified each supplier of the ownership change." She said, her voice rising sharply, "You did this on purpose." I said, "I made a legitimate business decision regarding contracts I personally own and control. Those arrangements existed because of relationships I built over years. I'm not obligated to continue extending personal advantages to businesses I no longer have any ownership stake in." The following months proved genuinely difficult for Chelsea's 3 locations. Operating costs increased significantly under standard corporate supplier pricing. Inconsistent delivery scheduling created regular ingredient shortages during peak business hours, directly damaging customer satisfaction and repeat business. Chelsea, lacking the specific operational experience I had built over more than a decade working within the Harvest Cup system, struggled significantly to adapt her management approach to these new financial and logistical pressures. My parents called me repeatedly during this period, initially confused, then increasingly frustrated as Chelsea's financial struggles became impossible to ignore. My father said, during one particularly difficult call, "Hannah, Chelsea says her costs have skyrocketed since taking over those locations. Do you know anything about that?" I said, "Dad, I explained to Chelsea directly what happened. The private supplier arrangements that kept those locations profitable existed through my own separate company, one that was never included in the transfer agreement you all asked me to sign. That agreement only covered the Harvest Cup franchise assets themselves." My mother said, joining the call, "Hannah, you knew this would happen when you signed that agreement, didn't you?" I said, honestly, I understood exactly what was included in that agreement and exactly what wasn't. I never misrepresented anything. Nobody asked me about the supplier arrangements during any of our conversations, and I was never obligated to volunteer information about a completely separate business entity that wasn't part of what you were asking me to transfer. I want to describe honestly the complicated emotions I experienced during this period, because the story would feel incomplete pretending this felt simple or purely satisfying. I genuinely cared about Chelsea's well-being, despite everything that had happened between us. Watching her struggle financially, watching our parents' visible distress as the situation deteriorated, created real internal conflict, even as I remained confident in the legitimacy of my own business decisions. Chelsea's 3 locations continued struggling significantly across the following several months. Rising costs, inconsistent supply, and Chelsea's limited operational experience combined to create a financial situation that grew genuinely unsustainable. She attempted to renegotiate directly with several suppliers herself, but without the years of relationship building and trust I had personally invested, she found herself unable to secure anything close to the pricing and reliability those locations had previously enjoyed under my ownership. By the 6th month following the ownership transfer, Chelsea's 3 locations had lost a combined value that her own accountant eventually calculated. During a family conversation my parents insisted I attend, at approximately $430,000, reflecting declining revenue, increased operational costs, and a significant drop in the location's overall market valuation compared to their worth at the moment of transfer. Chelsea filed for formal bankruptcy protection on those 3 locations roughly 8 months after taking ownership, unable to sustain the mounting debt created by months of unsustainable operating costs, combined with declining customer traffic, as service quality and product consistency deteriorated significantly under the standard corporate supply arrangement. The family conversation following Chelsea's bankruptcy filing remains one of the most difficult conversations of my entire life, though not for the reasons my parents initially expected walking into it. My parents called an emergency family meeting at their house, clearly hoping I would step in and rescue Chelsea's failing locations, perhaps by formally reinstating the private supplier arrangements or by providing some direct financial assistance to cover the mounting debt. My father said, opening the conversation, "Hannah, your sister is losing everything. We need to figure out how to help her." I said carefully, "Dad, I genuinely feel for Chelsea's situation, but I want to be honest about something important. Those 3 locations struggled specifically because they lost access to supplier relationships that took me over a decade to build personally. Those relationships were never part of what I agreed to transfer. I explained this clearly to both of you and to Chelsea from the very beginning of this situation." My mother said, her voice carrying genuine distress, "Hannah, you knew ending those supplier contracts would destroy her business. How could you do that to your own sister?" I said, "Mom, I want you to genuinely consider something. You and Dad asked me to hand over a business I built entirely with my own hands, using knowledge and relationships I spent over a decade developing, framing my hesitation as selfishness and threatening our entire family relationship if I refused. I signed that agreement specifically as it was presented to me. I never misrepresented what was included. The private supplier company was always mine, entirely separate, and I made a legitimate decision about my own separate business." The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Chelsea, sitting across the table, finally spoke, her earlier anger replaced by something closer to genuine reflection. She said, "Hannah, I think I understand now what I actually asked you to give up. I wanted the appearance of success without genuinely understanding what building something like that actually requires. I'm sorry." I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Chelsea. I never wanted to see you struggle this significantly. But I also couldn't continue extending personal advantages, built through years of my own relationship work, to a business situation I never would have chosen for myself." The following year brought a slow, careful rebuilding of my relationship with my family, built on considerably more honest terms than existed before this entire situation unfolded. My parents eventually acknowledged, during a private conversation roughly a year later, that they had genuinely misunderstood exactly what they were asking me to sacrifice, framing years of my personal effort as something owed to Chelsea simply through family obligation, rather than genuine earned partnership. Chelsea, following the bankruptcy proceedings, approached me directly with a considerably different request than her original demand. She said, "Hannah, I don't want anything handed to me anymore. I want to actually learn this business, the real way, starting from an entry-level position if that's what it takes." I offered her a genuine, entry-level management training position within my remaining 4 Harvest Cup locations, the same starting point I had occupied myself years earlier working for Patricia Nolan. Chelsea accepted, and over the following 2 years, she genuinely applied herself, learning supplier relationships, inventory management, and operational logistics with real dedication I never expected to witness from her. I think often about that Sunday dinner years earlier, watching my parents slide that transfer document across the table, framing my hesitation as selfishness rather than understanding it as genuine protection of something I had built through real personal sacrifice. I think about the specific moment I understood clearly that ownership of a business name and ownership of the actual foundation, supporting that business, represent 2 genuinely different things entirely. If there's one lesson I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Family loyalty matters deeply, genuinely, but loyalty should never require erasing the value of your own hard work simply to satisfy someone else's need for validation. Real support looks like mentorship, like patience, like genuine effort. It rarely looks like demanding something you never built yourself. Some family lessons arrive gently, over quiet conversations and slow understanding. Ours arrived the hard way, through bankruptcy filings and $430,000 in lost value, a genuinely painful path toward a truth that could have arrived far more easily with honest conversation from the very beginning. I think about Patricia Nolan often, about the specific lesson she taught me years earlier behind that smoothie counter, that a brand gets people through the door once. But what actually keeps a business alive lives in the relationships and the work happening behind the scenes that nobody else ever sees. That lesson protected me during the most difficult family conflict of my entire life, and I remain genuinely grateful for it every single day. Chelsea and I have a considerably different relationship today, built on mutual respect rather than obligation, on her genuine effort to learn rather than her expectation of simply receiving. My parents, too, understand now the specific difference between asking for help and demanding sacrifice. The lesson underneath this entire story stays simple, even though living through it never felt simple at all. Protect what you build. Understand exactly what you're being asked to give away before you ever sign anything. And remember that real family support builds people up through genuine effort, rather than tearing down someone else's hard work to make that effort feel unnecessary. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire story. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Tell me what you think the true moral of this story actually is. Tell me if your own family has ever asked you to give up something you worked hard to build. If this story reached you today, please hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories exactly like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that real value comes from what you build with your own hands, not what someone else believes they deserve. I'll see you in the next one.